In Mansfield, Texas, trust had a price. For 16-year-old Adrianne Jones, that price was her life. Mansfield, Texas, 1995. The air held the faint chill of December, and the town moved through its usual rhythm, its streets painted with the stories of its people. Among them was 16-year-old Adrianne Jones, a bright spark in the quiet town. Her laughter had the power to light up any room, and her dreams were as vast as the open Texas sky. Adrianne was the kind of girl who excelled at everything: academics, sports, and with a charm that left everyone around her feeling a little better. But behind that radiant smile was a teenager navigating a world of pressure and personal turmoil, where dreams collided with the heavy weight of expectations. That Sunday night, Adrianne was granted a rare privilege. Her parents, protective and loving, let her stay up late for a phone call with her boyfriend, Tracy. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. During their conversation, the phone buzzed with a second call. It was David Graham, a member of her cross-country team. His voice was strained, full of urgency. Adrianne, ever the peacemaker, reassured Tracy it was just a teammate. What she didn't know was that this small, seemingly innocent act would set off a chain of events that no one could have imagined. The next morning, the alarm went off, but Adrianne didn't answer. Her mother, confused and concerned, walked into her room, only to be met with the eerie sight of an untouched bed and neatly placed running shoes. Adrianne was gone. Panic flooded her heart as she searched the house, her voice trembling with each call of her daughter's name. But there was no answer. Adrianne had vanished. As her family struggled to hold back rising fear, miles away, the morning sun cast light on a horror that no one could have prepared for. On a lonely farm road, a man spotted what he first thought was roadkill near his mailbox. But as he drew closer, his legs buckled beneath him. There, on the ground, lay the lifeless body of a young girl, bruised and bloodied, dressed in night clothes, a cruel blend of innocence and violence. The police arrived, their faces pale under the weight of what they saw. 2 gunshot wounds, one to the cheek and the other to the forehead, marked her body, an execution in cold blood. Her arms and legs were covered in scrapes and bruises, signs of a desperate struggle for escape. Her hair, tangled and matted, clung to her face, and her body lay unnaturally still, as if the earth itself had swallowed her final screams. The quiet town of Mansfield stood frozen, its breath stolen by the nightmare that had only just begun. Adrianne's disappearance unraveled like a fragile thread, pulling apart the peaceful fabric of Mansfield. Her parents, consumed by panic, reached out to the police, their voices trembling with fear and disbelief. But as hours stretched into a silent void, the hope they clung to began to fade, like a flickering candle in a dark room. Meanwhile, in Grand Prairie, the discovery of her lifeless body sparked the beginning of a nightmare for the town. The police worked relentlessly to identify her, each clue adding to the growing horror of the situation. Forensics painted a harrowing picture, a desperate struggle against impossible odds. The wounds on Adrianne's body told a story her voice could no longer share. Scrapes and cuts from barbed wire marked her arms and legs, evidence of her frantic attempt to escape. Bloodstains dotted the ground, forming a tragic trail that led to the cruel end of her journey. It was clear Adrianne fought to the very end, but she had no chance. Her life, filled with dreams of helping animals, running cross-country, and being with her family, was stolen in a matter of moments. The police, determined but shaken, surveyed the crime scene, a haunting silence hanging over everything. There were no immediate clues, just the chilling brutality of the act. Adrianne had been ambushed and executed in cold blood. The fact that she had been wearing her night clothes suggested she had been lured away from home by someone she trusted, someone close. The precision of her death was unmistakable. This wasn't random. It was deeply personal. Back in her parents' home, the clocks seemed to stop. Every minute felt like a lifetime, as they waited for news that would never come. Then the knock on the door shattered their fragile world. 2 officers stood there, their faces heavy with sorrow. Adrianne's mother collapsed to the floor, her anguished cries filling the house, drowning out everything else. Adrianne's father, unable to hold back his own tears, wrapped his arms around her, his silent grief mirroring the loss they both shared. Their daughter was gone, her life stolen in the most brutal way. At Mansfield High, the halls that once echoed with Adrianne's laughter were now filled with confusion and heartbreak. Students clung to each other, tears falling freely. Teachers stood frozen, struggling to console their classes. Adrianne had been a bright star. Her absence now left a darkness hanging over everyone who knew her. Questions swirled endlessly. Who could have done this? Why her? And more terrifying still, who was next? That night, the people of Mansfield locked their doors, their sense of safety shattered. Parents held their children tighter, offering reassurances that barely masked their own fear. In every corner of town, whispers of dread spread. Was this a random act of violence, or was something far more sinister unfolding right under their noses? Were they all being watched? As the police dug deeper, the case grew murkier, and with every passing day, the air in Mansfield felt heavier. A town once defined by its quiet routines now found itself living under a cloud of dread. Adrianne's parents, consumed by their grief, clung to each other, their shared anguish the only anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The discovery of Adrianne's body had set off a storm of speculation, each theory as terrifying as the last. Was this the work of a stranger, or had someone she trusted betrayed her in the most heinous way? The unanswered questions festered, leaving the community grappling with paranoia and fear. The investigation began with the people closest to Adrianne. Her boyfriend, Tracy Smith, was the first to face scrutiny. The police pressed him about their last conversation, searching for any clue that might lead them closer to the truth. Tracy, visibly shaken, recounted how Adrianne had mentioned receiving another call that night, a boy named David from her cross-country team. His grief was palpable, but his alibi was airtight. He had been out of town with his family when Adrianne vanished. The investigators shifted their focus. David was a name barely tethered to anything concrete, but it was all they had. Adrianne's coach confirmed there was a David Graham on the cross-country team, a young man whose charm and ambition had made him a standout. On paper, David was the golden boy, a top student, an athlete, and a young man with aspirations of becoming an Air Force pilot. But as the police delved deeper, they couldn't ignore the feeling that beneath his polished exterior, something darker might be lurking. When questioned, David remained unnervingly composed. He admitted to knowing Adrianne, but dismissed their relationship as purely professional, teammates, nothing more. His answers were measured, his demeanor unflappable. Yet, as the officers pressed him about his whereabouts on the night of her murder, small cracks began to show. David claimed he had spent the evening studying with his girlfriend, Adrianne Jones, another overachiever with military aspirations. There was no immediate evidence to challenge his story, but the detective's unease lingered. As days turned into weeks, the case began to stagnate. Leads fizzled out, and the trail to Adrianne's killer seemed to dissolve into the ether. The weight of their failure settled heavily on the investigators, but it was nothing compared to the anguish gripping Adrianne's parents. Each day without answers deepened their despair. The hope they had clung to in the early days was eroding, replaced by the gnawing fear that justice might never come. Mansfield, too, grew restless. Whispers of the case filled the town, each rumor a reminder that Adrianne's killer still walked among them. 9 months after Adrianne's murder, the break the police had been desperate for came from an unexpected place, the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Adrianne Jones, now a cadet, had confided in her fellow cadets during a heated argument. Her words were chilling, her tone carrying a macabre pride. She and her boyfriend, David Graham, had killed Adrianne Jones. The revelation sent shock waves through the academy. Her peers, stunned and horrified, reported her admission to their superiors, and the authorities in Mansfield were contacted immediately. When investigators arrived at the Naval Academy, they found Adrianne stone-faced, her defiance palpable. She denied everything, her voice steady and unwavering, but the cracks in her facade were visible. Her classmates' accounts painted an unsettling picture, and the officers knew they were standing on the precipice of uncovering the truth. With Adrianne refusing to cooperate, the investigators turned their attention to David Graham, now enrolled at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. David's interrogation began as expected, calm, calculated, and rehearsed. He denied involvement, his words sharp and deliberate. But as the pressure mounted, his composure faltered. The room seemed to close in around him, and his breaths grew shallower. His hands, steady at the start, began to tremble. The silence between questions became unbearable, and finally, with a voice heavy with guilt and fear, David began to speak. The truth came pouring out, each word dragging him deeper into the gravity of what he had done. Even the seasoned detectives, who had heard countless confessions over their careers, sat stunned, their stomachs twisting as David detailed a crime so cruel it seemed almost incomprehensible. David Graham's confession came in fits and starts, his voice trembling under the weight of his words. Each sentence sliced through the room like a blade, revealing a story of jealousy, manipulation, and unthinkable cruelty. An ordinary love twisted into something monstrous. The officers listening sat motionless, their faces heavy with disbelief, as David unraveled the horrific events that led to Adrianne's death. It began with Adrianne Jones, his girlfriend, a young woman as ambitious and disciplined as David, but with a love that was fiercely possessive. Adrianne adored David, but her adoration was edged with control, an obsession that demanded absolute devotion. One night, overwhelmed by guilt, David admitted to a mistake, a brief, impulsive encounter with Adrianne Jones after a cross-country meet. He hoped his honesty might absolve him, might somehow strengthen their bond. But Adrianne's reaction was not one of forgiveness. Her rage was immediate, volcanic. Her voice, sharp and trembling, cut through the air as she lashed out at David. Her heartbreak curdled into hatred, and her mind settled on one solution. Adrianne had to pay. Diane's love became venomous, her anger feeding a need for revenge that bordered on madness. Desperate to save their relationship, David agreed to her horrifying demand. Together, they devised a plan, a pact born not out of love, but out of desperation and manipulation. David described the night of December 3rd, 1995, in agonizing detail. He called Adrianne, his voice calm, persuading her to meet him late at night. Adrianne hesitated, but David's tone reassured her. Trusting him as a friend and teammate, she reluctantly agreed. What she couldn't have known was that Diane was hiding in the hatchback of David's car, her silence cold and deliberate. Her presence turned that car into a trap. At 2:30 a.m., David pulled up outside Adrianne's house. She slipped out quietly, dressed in her night clothes, her face softened with the trust only a friend could inspire. She climbed into the front seat, chatting casually, unaware that her life was hurtling toward an unimaginable horror. The road stretched out before them, and David drove toward Seaton Road, a secluded spot 10 miles outside town. The night was eerily still, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Adrianne had no idea what waited in the darkness. The attack was swift and brutal. Diane emerged from the back of the car, gripping a dumbbell from David's gym set. With a burst of fury, she swung it at Adrianne's head. The dull, sickening thud shattered the night's quiet, and Adrianne screamed, her voice raw with terror and pain. Blood streamed down her face as she fought to survive, her instincts overpowering her fear. She clawed at the door, somehow finding the strength to escape. Her bare feet hit the ground, and she ran into the darkness, stumbling over gravel and barbed wire, leaving behind a trail of blood. Panic overtook Diane and David. Adrianne's cries pierced the night, each one a dagger in their already fraying resolve. In the chaos, David grabbed his Makarov 9mm pistol and ran after her. Adrianne, weakened by her injuries, didn't make it far. She collapsed in the field, the weight of her wounds too much to bear. David reached her, his breaths ragged, his hands trembling. For a brief moment, regret flashed through his mind, but it was too late. The plan had gone too far. With hands shaking, he raised the gun and pulled the trigger twice, once to her cheek and once to her forehead. The gunshots echoed into silence, and Adrianne was gone. When they returned to the car, the enormity of what they had done pressed down on them. Their hands were stained with blood, their breaths shallow with the remnants of adrenaline. Diane looked at David, and they uttered the words that would haunt everyone who heard their story. "I love you." The phrase, meant to seal their bond, was grotesque in its context, a twisted declaration forged in blood and betrayal. As David finished his confession, the room fell silent, the air thick with disbelief and horror. The officers, hardened by years of witnessing humanity's worst, found themselves shaken. This wasn't just a murder. It was an act of unfathomable betrayal, carried out by two people who believed their love justified everything. Adrianne hadn't just been killed. She had been hunted, her trust shattered in her final moments. When confronted with David's confession, Diane initially denied everything, her composure cracking under the pressure. But as evidence piled up, the facade fell. Diane broke, recounting her version of the events, a tale filled with anger and blame. In her eyes, David was the true monster, the one who had pulled the trigger. They turned on each other, each one desperate to salvage what little humanity they had left in the eyes of the law. But the truth was undeniable. They had both made a choice that night, a choice that ended an innocent life and stained their own forever. As the confessions unraveled, the horrific truth of Adrianne's final moments swept through Mansfield like a wildfire, leaving devastation in its wake. The town, already gripped by fear, now seethed with outrage. Adrianne had placed her trust in someone who betrayed her in the most unimaginable way, and her killers, once seen as role models, were now the faces of humanity's darkest capacity for cruelty. The trial promised to expose the full extent of their depravity, forcing everyone to confront the unspeakable horrors that had been hidden behind their polished exteriors. Diane Zamora was the first to stand trial. In the courtroom, the prosecution painted her as a young woman so consumed by jealousy that she believed murder was the only way to mend her wounded pride. Witness after witness described Diane's chilling lack of remorse and her haunting boast to Naval Academy classmates about the murder. Adrianne's parents sat through it all, their faces etched with both grief and rage, as the brutal details of their daughter's last moments were laid bare for all to hear. Every word felt like a knife, twisting deeper into wounds that had never healed. The jury's decision didn't take long. On February 17, 1998, Diane Zamora was found guilty of capital murder. Her sentence, life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. As the judge delivered the sentence, Adrianne's mother clutched a photograph of her daughter to her chest, her tears falling silently. Her husband's arm was wrapped tightly around her, as though it was the only thing holding her together. Diane, in contrast, remained expressionless, her face an unreadable mask. If the gravity of what she had done had struck her, she gave no sign. David Graham's trial came shortly after. His defense team tried to deflect the blame entirely onto Diane, portraying him as a vulnerable young man manipulated by a vindictive girlfriend. But his written confession, raw and unfiltered, was impossible to ignore. The prosecution emphasized David's active role in the murder, the deliberate planning, the cold execution, and the betrayal of a girl who had trusted him. He wasn't a victim of Diane's manipulation. He was a willing participant in Adrianne's death, someone who had chosen to end an innocent life for the sake of a toxic relationship. Adrianne's family endured every moment of the trial, reliving the nightmare in excruciating detail. Friends and classmates took the stand, their voices trembling as they shared memories of Adrianne's kindness, her laughter, and the light she brought to their lives. Their words painted a picture of the girl who had been stolen from them, making her absence all the more unbearable. The courtroom was heavy with grief, the air thick with a collective sorrow that seemed almost too much to bear. The jury found David guilty of capital murder. Like Diane, he was sentenced to life in prison, with parole eligibility after 40 years. But for Adrianne's parents, there was no such thing as closure. The verdicts were just words, incapable of filling the void left by their daughter. The image of Adrianne lying lifeless in that field, her face bruised and her spirit stolen, was a nightmare they would carry with them forever. Justice, as necessary as it was, felt hollow against the enormity of their loss. After the trials, Mansfield began the slow, painful process of healing. The scars Adrianne's murder left were etched deep, visible in the cautious glances of neighbors and the tighter grips parents kept on their children. Her friends carried her memory with them, their laughter tinged with sadness whenever they thought of her. The once bright futures of Diane Zamora and David Graham now led to cold, gray prison cells, places where they had nothing but time to reflect on the unimaginable crime that had forever bound their fates together. The trials had ended, but for Adrianne's parents, the torment only deepened with time. Their home, once alive with her laughter and warmth, now echoed with a haunting silence. Her bedroom remained untouched, a quiet sanctuary where memories clung to every corner. Her mother often sat on the bed, clutching Adrianne's favorite sweater, or running her fingers over a framed photo. She whispered to the emptiness, as if her daughter could somehow hear her words. Her father, once the pillar of the family, seemed to shrink under the weight of his grief. His eyes, always so steady, now held a pain too profound for words. Every picture on the wall, every trophy on the shelf, was a double-edged sword, a reminder of Adrianne's vibrant life and the dreams she would never fulfill. The community of Mansfield felt the weight of the loss just as heavily. Adrianne's murder wasn't just a tragedy for her family. It was a wound that stretched across the entire town. Candlelight vigils became a way for people to come together, sharing their sorrow and their stories of Adrianne's kindness. Her classmates, now grown and scattered, spoke of her unyielding energy and the light she brought into every room she entered. Yet beneath the mourning, a simmering anger took root, a collective rage directed at the two people who had so callously taken her life. Diane Zamora and David Graham, once seen as symbols of promise and ambition, became pariahs even behind prison walls. Diane, who had once dreamed of commanding naval ships, now spent her days in a routine that stripped away every ounce of freedom she had cherished. She wrote letters to her family, trying to shift blame and cast herself as a victim, but the truth clung to her like a second skin, inescapable and damning. Each night, the weight of what she had done settled over her, like a suffocating blanket, a reminder that some shadows could never be escaped. David fared no better. The dreams of soaring through the skies as an Air Force pilot were replaced with the monotony of prison life, his only view a bleak concrete horizon. He replayed that night in his mind endlessly, Adrianne's terrified face etched into his memory. The sound of the gunshots echoed in his thoughts, a constant reminder of the life he had extinguished. His love for Diane, once fiery and unshakable, now felt like a distant nightmare, an obsession that had led him to abandon every moral he had once held dear. Regret consumed him, a heavy chain dragging him deeper into himself with every passing day. Adrianne's story became a warning, a chilling reminder of how jealousy and unchecked emotions could spiral into unimaginable violence. Parents shared her tale with their children, warning them about toxic relationships and the perils of blind devotion. Teachers discussed her in classrooms, her name becoming a symbol of a life stolen too soon. But for Adrianne's family, these lessons, though important, couldn't fill the emptiness she had left behind. Every missed milestone, her graduation, the career she had dreamed of, the family she would never have, was a fresh wound, a reminder of the future that had been stolen from her. Her mother, despite her grief, found strength in advocacy. She spoke at events, her voice trembling but resolute, calling for stronger protections for young women and harsher penalties for violent crimes. No parent should have to endure this, she would say, her tears flowing freely. Yet even as she fought for change, her heart ached for the daughter she would never hold again. As time moved forward, Mansfield began to heal, though the scars Adrianne's murder left were indelible. The field where her body had been found became a quiet place of reflection, where flowers and handwritten notes often appeared, left by those who hadn't forgotten. Adrianne's story lived on, not as a symbol of despair, but as a call to cherish life, to stand against the darkness, and to remember that even in the face of unimaginable loss, love endures. Her mother, in moments of stillness, would often look to the sky. The stars, scattered across the night, seemed brighter, and she imagined Adrianne among them, shining as she had in life. "You'll always be my little girl," she would whisper into the silence, her voice thick with love and longing. "I'll carry you with me, always." Years passed, but Adrianne Jones's memory stayed vivid, etched in the hearts of those who loved her. For her family, the ache of her loss was a constant shadow, a weight they carried every day. Yet they found strength in honoring her life, determined that her story would not be remembered as just a tragedy. They established a scholarship in her name at Mansfield High School, a way to give hope to young women with dreams as bright as Adrianne's had been. Every year, when the scholarship was awarded, her parents attended the ceremony. Their tears would glisten, a mixture of pride and sorrow, as they saw Adrianne's spirit reflected in the lives of others moving forward. Adrianne's classmates grew older, following paths to college, careers, and families, but her absence lingered. To them, she was more than a memory. She was a piece of their youth, a reminder of how fragile life could be. Her name would often come up in quiet conversations, shared with their own children as a lesson about kindness and the fleeting nature of time. For the teachers who had once marveled at Adrianne's determination and zest for life, her empty desk was a painful reminder of the promise that had been stolen. Even years later, they spoke of her with a bittersweet fondness, her name evoking both a smile and a tear. Mansfield itself was forever changed. Once a place where unlocked doors symbolized trust, it became a town marked by caution. Parents held their children closer, fearful of the dangers that had once seemed so distant. Yet, in the wake of this tragedy, the community found a shared resilience. Adrianne's story became a call to protect and cherish what mattered most, ensuring her name was never forgotten. Inside the cold confines of their separate prisons, Diane Zamora and David Graham served their sentences. The bond they had once shared, fractured by their mutual guilt. Diane, once ambitious and fiercely in love, now moved through her days with mechanical monotony. The walls of her cell bore silent witness to her attempts to justify her actions. But even to herself, the words rang hollow. She wrote letters to her family, desperate to explain. Yet no letter could undo the past or cleanse the weight of her choices. David, on the other hand, carried a quieter torment. His mind often drifted back to that fateful night, the details of Adrianne's murder replaying endlessly. He would write apology letters to Adrianne's family, pouring out his guilt in words he never had the courage to send. In the stillness of his cell, he realized that the person he had been, the boy so blindly devoted to Diane, was gone. All that remained was the memory of his crime and the unbearable regret it brought. For Adrianne's parents, the knowledge that her killers would spend decades behind bars brought little solace. Justice felt like a shadow compared to the overwhelming light of the life they had lost. What they yearned for, more than anything, was to see their daughter's radiant smile again, to hear her laughter fill their home, and to hold her tightly, if only for a moment. All they were left with were memories, beautiful but fleeting fragments of the girl who had once been the heart of their family. Adrianne's story resonated far beyond Mansfield. Her face, immortalized in photographs, became a symbol of lost potential and the devastating consequences of jealousy. Her story was retold in articles, documentaries, and books, each retelling a plea for vigilance against toxic relationships and unchecked emotions. People who had never met Adrianne felt connected to her, moved by the injustice of her fate, and inspired by the resilience of her family. In the quiet moments of the night, Adrianne's mother would sometimes step outside and look up at the stars. She imagined her daughter's spirit among them, shining as brightly as she had in life. "You'll always be my little girl," she whispered, her voice heavy with love and longing. "I'll never stop loving you." Adrianne Jones was far more than the victim of a crime. She was a daughter who brought warmth to her family, a friend who inspired others, and a young woman full of dreams. Though her life ended in unimaginable cruelty, her legacy endured, a testament to love, memory, and the unyielding fight for justice, even in the face of overwhelming darkness.